The lights were bright, almost unforgiving, washing the Senate chamber in a glow that made every twitch, every glance, impossible to miss. And in that moment, all eyes shifted to one man. Mitt Romney leaned forward, voice sharpened like a blade. Disguised as a question, "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, pausing for effect. "With your limited experience, do you really believe you're qualified to weigh in on matters of this magnitude?" A hush rippled across the room. The phrasing was precise, rehearsed, dripping with the kind of polite condescension that masked deeper doubt. Romney didn't just ask a question, he set a trap. His lips curled into a restrained smirk, as though he had already won the exchange before it began. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing that flicker of satisfaction. The look of a veteran politician confident that his years of service gave him the authority to diminish a rising voice. Around the chamber, a low murmur rose, the subtle shuffling of aides, the tightening grip of pens against notepads, and then silence. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't scramble for credentials or stumble over statistics. Instead, she let the weight of the moment breathe. Her eyes fixed straight ahead, unshaken, holding steady in the storm of expectation. Seconds passed like minutes. The silence grew louder than any outburst could have. Romney's smirk widened, misreading composure as hesitation. He thought he had found the weakness, the gap in her armor, the moment he could point to and say, "See? Not ready. Not seasoned, not capable." But what he failed to see, what the audience was just beginning to sense, was that Crockett wasn't caught off guard, was preparing. The camera cut between them, Romney leaning back with that air of superiority, and Crockett, still as stone, her calm becoming its own kind of defiance. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Even inside the chamber, the air shifted, anticipation tightening like a drum about to strike. He thought he was exposing her inexperience. Instead, he exposed his own miscalculation. And as Crockett drew in her breath, the room seemed to hold it with Herbie, because her reply would silence even the most seasoned. "Senator, this was no ordinary question tossed in the middle of a hearing. It was a gauntlet thrown, the kind of moment that carried weight far beyond the four walls of the chamber. Because when Mitt Romney pressed Jasmine Crockett about her limited experience, he wasn't just speaking as a man with decades in politics, he was speaking as a symbol of an entire establishment that had long decided who was worthy to be heard and who was not. Romney represented the old guard. Wealth, pedigree, a resume that stretched back to an America many no longer recognized. He was the gatekeeper, the custodian of traditions that too often excluded voices like Crockett's. In his carefully phrased jab, there was an unspoken message. Stay in your lane. Wait your turn. Defer to those who came before you. But Crockett, sitting poised under the scrutiny of the cameras, embodied something entirely different. She was not just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a new voice of America young, unapologetically black, female, unbowed by pedigree or privilege. Her very presence in that chamber was a challenge to the old rules of who belonged. The clash, unfolding before the public, wasn't merely about policy. It was generational, racial, and cultural. Romney's smirk wasn't aimed at her alone. It was aimed at everyone who had ever been told they weren't seasoned enough, polished enough, connected enough to sit at the table. And in Crockett's silence, in her refusal to take the bait immediately, there was a power that began to ripple through the room. Those who watched live felt the tension tighten. This wasn't just about one exchange. It was about what America was becoming. Would it remain tethered to the old politics of hierarchy and gatekeeping? Or could it embrace a new voice, one forged not in legacy, but in lived experience? Millions at home didn't know it yet, but the cameras were capturing a moment that would soon dominate social feeds. The clip would be replayed endlessly, dissected, memed, turned into late-night punchlines and early morning headlines. But in that exact second, it was still raw, unshaped. Hanging in the air like lightning waiting for the strike, Romney's allies shifted in their seats, sensing victory. To them, the silence looked like defeat. But Crockett's allies knew better. They recognized the discipline in her stillness, the refusal to give Romney the satisfaction of a rushed or emotional reaction.
Wow.
This was composure learned not in ivy-covered lecture halls, but in communities where patience, resilience, and strategy were survival skills. For Crockett, the stakes were higher than just this one exchange. Every word she spoke would be weighed against stereotypes, scrutinized for tone, mined for mistakes. To slip, even slightly, would hand her critics the headline they were waiting for. But to hold steady, to answer with calm precision, would flip the balance of power entirely. And that was the gamble Romney never accounted for. He believed experience was measured in years served, titles held, networks built. Crockett knew experience could also be measured in battles survived, communities represented. Truths spoken in rooms that never wanted to hear them. The silence stretched further, building like a drum roll. The murmurs grew faint, replaced by the collective awareness that something bigger was happening than just another Senate sparring match. Because before the viral ignition, before the hashtags and the memes, before America picked sides in the digital coliseum, the pressure inside that chamber was about to explode. Mitt Romney did not arrive at that chamber as an ordinary senator. He arrived, wrapped in the armor of decades, an armor forged from wealth, legacy, and the safety of being. Born into privilege, the Romney name had always opened doors, smoothed paths, and softened blows. He was the polished face of a political dynasty that could trace its power not to grassroots struggle, but to boardrooms. That influence and the easy comfort of generational wealth. His resume gleamed. Governor, presidential nominee, senator. On paper, it was the kind of career Washington reveres, predictable, respectable, saturated with the aura of experience. To the establishment, he was a safe insider. He spoke their language, wore their tailored suits, and understood the unspoken rules of hierarchy that had governed the Capitol for generations. But beneath that polish lay contradictions that gnawed at the edges of his legacy. Romney liked to posture as a moral compass, a voice of reason in turbulent times, gave speeches about unity, about the dangers of partisanship, about protecting democracy from extremism. Yet those lofty words were undercut by his own history, of gatekeeping, of dismissing those who didn't come from the same cloth as himself. His reasonableness often looked less like courage and more like elitism dressed as virtue. There were moments small, it's almost forgotten, that revealed the pattern. Years ago, he once waved off a young lawmaker's proposal with the remark, "Ambition is admirable, but wisdom comes with time." Another time, when pressed on issues of systemic inequality, he said, "In America, everyone has the same opportunities. It's about how hard you work." To some, those comments sounded pragmatic, but to others they dripped with the arrogance of someone who had never known the crushing weight of doors closed before they could even knock. Romney's career was full of these quiet dismissals, the casual underestimation of voices that didn't mirror his own path. He believed himself to be measured, cautious above the fray. But what he didn't realize was that his very posturdom, elite, untouchable, was itself a weapon, one that minimized, excluded, and silenced. And in that chamber, when he leaned forward with his carefully sharpened question about Jasmine Crockett's limited experience, it wasn't just words. It was the echo of every gatekeeper who had ever told someone younger, poorer, darker, or female, that they hadn't earned the right to stand on equal ground. Romney carried Washington's armor, the confidence of someone who had always been taken seriously, the poise of a man who had never needed to justify his presence. But arrogance, no matter how well polished, always leaves cracks. Cracks of hypocrisy, cracks of elitism, cracks of distance between the world he claimed to represent and the realities lived by millions of Americans, because while Romney spoke of unity, he had never truly stood shoulder to shoulder with those who fought for inclusion from the margins. While he spoke of fairness, he had reaped the benefits of a system tilted in his favor. While he cast himself as a stabilizing elder statesman, he had time and again reinforced the very hierarchies that kept new voices out. The irony was stark. Romney believed he was defending tradition. In reality, he was defending walls built to protect people like him from being challenged by people like her. In this moment, his contradictions were laid bare. He was a man who had walked the halls of power for decades, yet could not see how blind he had become to its exclusions. He thought himself a teacher, a judge of readiness, but what he had failed to recognize was that history had shifted beneath his feet. America no longer wanted the same old gatekeepers. It wanted something rawer, more authentic voices that spoke not from ivory towers, but from lived struggle. And so his question carried all the weight of entitlement disguised as mentorship. He thought it clever, thought it incisive, he thought. It exposed Crockett's weakness. But in truth, it exposed his own. Because what Romney never prepared for was the possibility that someone could pierce through the armor, not by matching his condescension, but by dismantling it with composure. His decades of privilege had trained him for sparring with equals who looked and sounded just like him. They had not prepared him for Jasmine Crockett, and that was his blind spot. That was his crack. He leaned into the moment, believing the hierarchy was still intact, that his question would land like a gavel, silencing, instructing, reminding everyone of who held authority. But history was waiting to prove him wrong, and it was through those cracks that Crockett would strike. Jasmine Crockett was not supposed to be there, at least, not according to the unwritten rules of American politics. Those rules had been drafted, long before her, in boardrooms and backrooms, by men who looked nothing like her and lived lives she could hardly recognize. But Crockett didn't grow up studying the rules. She grew up defying them. Her roots were working class, stitched together with grit and sacrifice. She came of age not in halls of privilege, but in communities where survival was never guaranteed and opportunity had to be seized. Claude fought for. Her parents worked long hours, teaching her early that dignity wasn't given, it was earned. Dinner table lessons were not about power plays or political dynasties. They were about standing tall, even when life tried to push you to your knees. From those beginnings, Crockett's compass was set. She poured herself into education, into the belief that knowledge could carve open doors that prejudice kept sealed shut. Law school was not a smooth climb, but a series of tests, financial, strained doubters whispering she didn't belong, professors who looked past her to the louder, whiter voices in the room. But every dismissal only sharpened her resolve. By the time she walked into her first courtroom as an attorney, she already carried the unspoken understanding that she would have to fight harder, speak clearer, and work twice as much to be heard once. And fight she did. She carved a reputation in civil rights law, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had no voice. She took on cases most would avoid, families crushed by injustice, workers silenced by corporations, people beaten down by systems rigged against them. She learned how to face louder rooms, tougher judges, harsher critics. She learned how to hold her ground even when the weight of the law, the press, and the establishment pressed back. Yet the courtroom was only the beginning. Crockett's calling was bigger than a defense table. The injustice she saw daily demanded more than legal victories, it demanded systemic change. And so she stepped into politics, carrying with her the scars of the battles she had fought for others, and the fire of a woman determined not to let those battles be in vain. But stepping into politics as a black woman was its own war. She was underestimated, dismissed, caricatured. Pundits sneered that she was too inexperienced, too emotional, too radical. Colleagues in quiet hallways questioned if she was really ready. Every step forward meant pushing through layers of doubt, not built from her own actions, but from centuries of bias. To some, she was never going to be enough. To others, she was always going to be too much, and yet she never bent. She never softened her voice to make others comfortable. She never traded her fire for the false promise of acceptance. Because Crockett understood something the establishment never did. Readiness wasn't a matter of pedigree, or years in the Senate, or family names carved into history. Readiness was forged in the storms you survived, in the fires you refused to let consume you. Her rise wasn't about being welcomed into the old order. It was about breaking it open. She embodied the new America, multiracial, unapologetic, relentless. She carried the weight of those told to wait their turn, of those silenced before they ever got to speak, of those who dared to imagine leadership without asking permission. This was why millions saw her not just as a politician, but as a symbol. She wasn't perfect. She didn't pretend to be, but she was real. She was human. She was tested. And every scar she carried became a badge that told others, you belong here too. When Jasmine Crockett walked into that chamber to face Mitt Romney, she wasn't just another lawmaker at a desk. Once she was the culmination of every courtroom dismissal, every whispered doubt. Every time someone tried to tell her she wasn't ready, she had already stood against louder voices than his, already faced harsher scrutiny, already survived storms meant to silence her. And so when Romney tried to corner her, when he leaned forward with his polished smirk and his cutting question about her experience, he believed he was exposing her weakness. He believed he was summoning the hierarchy that had always protected men like him. But Crockett's story was never about being ready on their terms. It was about being unbreakable on her own. It's about one of that unbreakable spirit the one forged. In working-class homes, sharpened in courtrooms, and carried into politics, was about to turn the tables. Which is why when Romney tried to corner her, he was walking into history. The air in the hearing room grew heavier with each second. The long oak desk stretched like a battlefield line, polished to a mirror sheen. But beneath that veneer was tension ready to crack. Mitt Romney leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence not with rage, but with that practiced, condescending calm that always seemed to suggest he already knew the answer to the question he was asking. "Congresswoman," he said, elongating the title just enough to make it sound like a reminder rather than respect, "could you explain what actual experience qualifies you to weigh in on matters of national consequence? Because from where I sit, I just don't see it." The words hung in the air like a verdict. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The smirk did the work for him. It was the smile of a man convinced that pedigree was power. The lineage was legitimacy. The decades in the Senate were the only currency of wisdom. Across the room, aides exchanged uneasy glances. Some lowered their eyes to their notes, as if hoping to avoid being caught in the crossfire of what was coming. The cameras shifted, lenses tightening on Crockett's face, waiting to capture a flinch, a stumble, a moment of visible doubt. But there was none. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her hands folded loosely on the desk. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she let silence claim the room. It was a silence that unnerved even her illustrator. For seconds that felt like an eternity on live television. Romney shifted slightly, misreading the pause as hesitation, his smirk stretching into something closer to victory. And then it happened. The faintest smile tugged at the corner of Crockett's lips. Not the nervous smile of someone outmatched, but the knowing smile of someone who had been underestimated too many times to count, and who had learned to make silence her weapon. She drew a slow, steady breath, her calm presence in stark contrast to the tension swirling around her. The cameras caught it all, Romney's eyes narrowing, light sitting straighter, the buzz of whispered anticipation in the gallery. America was watching, even if they didn't yet know this was the moment they'd be replaying in slow motion on every feed, every platform, every late-night recap. This wasn't just a question about qualifications. It was the establishment flexing its gatekeeping muscle, daring her to shrink under the weight of its arrogance. And Crockett knew it. She had faced louder voices, tougher judges, harsher critics. A senator's smirk was nothing compared to a system that had tried to silence her all her life. Still, the theatrics of the room pressed in. Romney, leaning back now, exuded the patience of a man expecting a stumble, a stammer, maybe even a slip of temper he could use later as ammunition. He was the picture of composure on the outside, but inside, he had already declared himself the winner. What he didn't understand was that Crockett had mastered this terrain long before she stepped foot in Washington. Silence, poise, timing, these were the tools of someone who had fought for every inch of recognition. Someone who knew that words delivered at the right moment could land like thunder. She adjusted the microphone gently, a gesture so small, yet so deliberate that it pulled every eye back to her. For a beat, the room held its breath, because everyone could sense it. Something was about to happen, and when she finally opened her mouth, the microphone crackled softly as Jasmine Crockett leaned in, her voice steady, low, and deliberate, the kind of tone that forces even the loudest skeptic to quiet down. No theatrics. No raised volume. Just calm precision. Senator, she began, her eyes fixed on Romney's with an unflinching steadiness. Experience is not defined by how many years someone warms a chair in these chambers. It is defined by the battles they've fought, the people they've defended, and the truths they've carried when it wasn't convenient. The words hit like a gavel. Romney's smirk faltered, almost imperceptibly at first. He shifted a paper in front of him, more for movement than necessity. He wasn't expecting calm. He wasn't expecting poise. He certainly wasn't expecting a counterattack that didn't even sound like one. It sounded like a lesson. Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. You ask what qualifies me? I'll tell you. I've stood in courtrooms defending the rights of those without a voice. I've fought against systems that told women like me to sit down and wait our turn. And I've walked into rooms where I was the youngest, the only black woman, and still demanded accountability from Thassa who believed they were untouchable. That is experience. The room grew still. You could almost hear the scribbling of reporters' pens as they caught every word. And let me remind you, she said, leaning slightly closer. Experience without empathy is just privilege. And privilege without accountability, that's not leadership. That's entitlement. The shift was seismic. Romney blinked rapidly, his mouth tightening into a line as though he was preparing to interject, but nothing came. Asa! His fingers fumbled with the stack of papers before him, suddenly restless, betraying the unease his face couldn't quite conceal. Crockett didn't raise her voice, but the cadence sharpened, every syllable deliberate, each pause amplifying her control of the room. You see, Senator, I wasn't born into power. I wasn't handed a legacy seat. I earned every inch of ground I stand on. And that matters because America isn't just built by the legacies of those who came before. It is built every single day by those who were told they didn't belong here and showed up anyway. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even aides who usually remained stoic found themselves exchanging glances. Romney's composure was fraying at the edges. He shuffled his notes again, eyes darting down and back up as if searching for an angle of attack. But Crockett gave him no opening. She pressed forward, steady and unyielding. In 30 seconds, one reporter would later tweet, she reversed decades of gatekeeping with one reply. And that wasn't hyperbole, because in those moments, Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was redefining the conversation. She wasn't playing defense at all. She had seized the offense, reframing the question not as a trap, but as an indictment of the system Romney represented. The power of her words was magnified by the contrast. Romney's barbed question, sharp with condescension, now looked petty against her calm clarity. His smirk, once a symbol of control, now seemed out of place, like arrogance caught in the act of crumbling. Every camera zoomed tighter, every microphone straining for nuance. Producers in control rooms across networks were already whispering the same phrase. That's the clip. And Crockett wasn't done. Senator, she concluded, voice soft but cutting with precision, the measure of a leader is not how long they've been in the room. It's whether they make space for others to enter. And with respect, the America I know is ready for more than recycled legacies. It's ready for progress. Silence afterward was deafening. For a full beat, Romney said nothing, blinked. Once, twice. He glanced down at his papers as though they might rescue him, but the words refused to come. When he finally cleared his throat, it was only to shuffle his notes again, a reflexive gesture to buy time. But the moment had already passed. By then, the chamber had shifted. Crockett had not only answered his question, she had exposed it. For what it was, a relic of gatekeeping disguised as concern. Within minutes, the outside world was already reacting. Tweets appeared like sparks. Crockett just dismantled Romney in real time. She turned a condescending jab into a masterclass in composure. This is why representation matters. Journalists huddled in the press gallery were whispering to each other, shaking their heads, some even grinning at the sheer audacity of what they had just witnessed. Cameramen glanced at their monitors with wide eyes, aware they had just captured political gold. It spread faster than wildfire. By the time the hearing adjourned, snippets of her reply were already trending. By the time evening rolled around, Hashtags had ignited across platforms. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Speechless Senator. Hashtag New America Rising. And by midnight, it was everywhere. How clips looped on TikTok with captions like, "How to handle a condescending senator in 30 seconds flat?" Reaction videos flooded YouTube, commentators dissecting her calm, body language experts highlighting Romney's sudden blinking and fidgeting. On Instagram Reels, her words were cut into sound bites, paired with triumphant music going viral. Not just as politics, but as culture. Cable networks picked it up too. Late-night hosts replayed the clip, their audiences roaring with laughter at Romney's stunned silence. Commentators called it one of the most decisive mic-drop moments of the year. Romney himself had retreated into silence, refusing to comment when cornered by reporters afterward. But the damage was done, not because he had been defeated, in the traditional sense, but because Crockett's reply had exposed his question as hollow. In the age of viral media, appearances matter as much as arguments. And on this night, the appearance was devastating. A seasoned senator blinking and fumbling papers while a younger congresswoman sat calm, articulate, and unshaken. The internet crowned its victor instantly. And yet, as explosive as it was in that chamber, the true blast radius was still unfolding. Because while Crockett's words had stunned Romney into silence, their reverberations were about to escape the confines of Washington. The real explosion wasn't inside the chamber, it was online. The hearing had barely adjourned before the digital world detonated. On Twitter, the first wave of hashtags surged with the force of a political earthquake. Hashtag Romney shook. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Experience Exposed. Each one carried 1,000 variations, amplified by voices that ranged from grassroots organizers to celebrities with millions of followers. The centerpiece of it all was the clip. 33 seconds that showed Jasmine Crockett calmly dismantling Mitt Romney's condescension while he blinked, shuffled papers, and sat in silence. Within hours, it was everywhere. Tato K Teens added remixes, setting Crockett's words against the booming bass of trending tracks. YouTube channels ran instant reaction videos, replaying her line about experience without empathy and slow motion, with zooms on Romney's face, as though it were the climax of a boxing match. On Instagram, the quote was already printed on shareable graphics with bold fonts and fiery backgrounds, passed around like gospel for a generation hungry too. See, dignity win over arrogance. The memes came fast and furious. One looping GIF showed Romney blinking over and over with the caption, "When you realize privilege isn't a resume." Another split screen compared Crockett's.com smile with Michael Jordan's last shot pose. Legendary composure. Late night. Comedy seized on the silence too, playing the clip on repeat while audiences roared. One host quipped, "Mitt Romney asked about her experience, and suddenly he experienced what silence tastes like." But as the laughter echoed across the internet, the commentary class sharpened their knives. Conservative pundits scrambled to frame the moment as disrespect or overhyped, insisting Crockett's calm confidence was arrogance in disguise. Yet their protest felt hollow, drowned out by the sheer force of the public's reaction. Pollsters noted in overnight surveys that an overwhelming majority of respondents thought Crockett came out on top. Even those unfamiliar with her name the day before now recognized her face, her voice, her poise, and that was the real shift. For every meme and punchline, there was also a sober undertone. Crockett's stature had been elevated. She wasn't just another congresswoman sparring in a hearing. She had become a national figure in a single exchange. Cable networks filled entire panels with debate over what it meant. One commentator called it a generational collision, a visible reminder that the old guard no longer controls the stage. Another more reluctantly admitted, Romney miscalculated. He walked in thinking he could lecture her. Instead, he gave her a platform. Even allies, who had privately doubted whether Crockett could break through in such a crowded political landscape, suddenly saw the path more clearly. Her campaign donations spiked. Her social media following doubled in days. Constituents back home flooded her office with messages of pride. Young activists clipped her words into motivational sound bites, using them to rally around broader causes, voting rights, racial justice, gender equity, in living rooms, college dorms, and workplace break rooms. The The exchange became shorthand for something larger. Parents showed the clip to their daughters. Mentors shared it with students. This, they said, is what it looks like to stay calm under fire. Romney, meanwhile, faced the opposite tide. His silence had become its own meme, his blinking. Replayed so often it was etched into the political consciousness. To his critics, it was the perfect metaphor, an aging gatekeeper caught flat-footed, unable to respond when challenged by the very future he sought to question. And yet, the ripple effect wasn't merely about individual reputations, it was about the culture of politics itself. Crockett's reply had tapped into a collective frustration, a hunger to see fresh voices dismantle the old hierarchies. Her moment of composure was more than a viral clip. It was a symbolic victory for every person who had ever been underestimated. Every newcomer told they didn't belong. By the week's end, think pieces filled op-ed pages. The Crockett Doctrine, one headline proclaimed, arguing that calm dignity could be more powerful than outrage in dismantling systemic condescension. Another declared, the experience debate is over, noting that Crockett had reframed the very definition of political readiness. It was undeniable. She had captured the cultural moment, but under the surface of the laughter, the memes, and the applause, something deeper stirred. For Romney and his generation, the silence wasn't just embarrassing, it was a warning shot, a reminder that the gatekeeping playbook, once so reliable, was cracking in real time, and for Crockett's generation, it was a Bacona signal that the future wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The world was still laughing at Romney's silence, but the echo that mattered most wasn't the joke. It was the shift in power, and beneath the memes lay something deeper, a generational warning shot. When the noise subsided, when the laughter of the late-night monologues quieted, when the hashtags slowed their climb, what remained was the lesson Jasmine Crockett had framed in that unforgettable reply. For her, experience was never about how many years someone warmed a chair in Washington. It was about endurance, resilience, truth. It was about the kind of lived struggle that could never be footnoted on a resume, the kind that forged a voice. Not just for oneself, but for millions who had been told they didn't belong. She reminded the country, not through anger, but through calm precision, that America's future isn't measured in decades of office holding or family lineage, is measured in the courage to speak, in the resolve to rise, and the refusal to be silenced. Crockett's words reverberated because they weren't only about her. They spoke to immigrants who had worked 2 jobs to give their children a chance. 2 women who had sat in boardrooms dismissed as too young or too emotional. 2 entire communities told their votes, their neighborhoods. Their voices didn't carry the same weight as the old establishments. In that chamber, dignity triumphed over arrogance. And in the living rooms of America, people felt the victory. As their own, Crockett had not shouted Romney down. She had not played to the spectacle. Instead, she leaned into truth and, in doing so, she revealed something timeless. Arrogance may rattle the walls for a moment, but dignity lasts. Gatekeepers can block the door, but truth finds another way in. The moral landed with a resonance that couldn't be spun away by pundits. It was simple, universal, and undeniable. The measure of leadership is not how long you've been in the room, but what you do when you finally step inside it. Crockett embodied that truth, standing as living proof that America's story is not static, it is still being written. Often by those the establishment least expects. She became more than the victor of a viral moment. She became a mirror reflecting the best version of the American promise back to those who had begun to doubt it. A reminder that justice, dignity, and truth do not depend on permission slips. From the powerful, they rise because they must. As one commentator put it, Romney brought his years, Crockett brought her fire, and only one of them left with the room behind her. And perhaps that was the greatest irony. Romney had tried to measure her worth in terms of his world's definition of experience, yet it was Crockett's answer that will be remembered long after his question is forgotten. Because history, as it turned out, was not written by the loudest in the room. It was written by the calmest voice that refused to be ignored. And that story wasn't finished yet. From the very first moment, this story wasn't just about a question. It was about power. Mitt Romney, armed with decades of establishment prestige, tried to press Jasmine Crockett into a corner. Smirked. He questioned, he assumed her silence would signal defeat. But silence, as we all witnessed, was only the breath before the storm. Crockett's reply didn't just answer, Mitt dismantled the arrogance behind the question itself. And that's why the moment went viral. Because in a chamber designed to reward those with the loudest voices and longest resumes, it was her composure that rewrote the script. Millions replayed it not just to watch Romney falter, but to feel something for themselves. That calm, that dignity, that surge of validation when truth wins out against condescension. It's why we titled this story exactly as it unfolded, MIT. Romney questioned her experience. She left him speechless, because those words capture not just the drama of a single exchange, but the timeless reality that every generation faces the old guard trying to measure worth by outdated terms, and the new voices rising to prove them wrong. And now, it's your turn. If this moment resonated with you, if you saw yourself in Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance, then be part of this growing community. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with friends who need to see dignity triumph over arrogance. Add your voice to the movement of viewers who believe that the future belongs not to gatekeepers, but to those who rise. Because history isn't written by those who question your worth, it's written by those who rise, reply, and redefine what power looks like. And together, we're here to write it.